They say funerals are moments of closure, times when the past is laid to rest and the living find a way to move forward. But for Daniel Whitmore, the funeral of his mother was not the end of a chapter, it was the opening of a wound he never knew existed. What should have been a day defined by solemn grief turned into the moment he discovered the biggest betrayal of his life. On a gray morning in Vermont, heavy clouds blanketed the hills surrounding the Whitmore estate. The air was damp, saturated with drizzle that blurred the outlines of the ancient stone chapel where generations of Whitmores had been buried. Inside and outside the chapel gathered a crowd of mourners, business partners, political figures, socialites, faces Daniel had seen for years at galas, charity balls, and fundraisers, now united in black attire and quiet whispers. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, had been a formidable figure, known as much for her philanthropy as for her iron grip on her family's legacy. Her sudden death left an absence that was felt far beyond the walls of her estate. Daniel stood at the edge of the burial site, holding an umbrella that shielded him from the steady drizzle. To the onlookers, he seemed unshaken, the very image of composure. At 36, he had the reputation of a man hardened by success and responsibility. He ran a technology empire that stretched from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, his decisions worth billions. Yet beneath the surface, his heart carried the weight of unresolved guilt. The last conversation with his mother had been rushed, transactional, and impatient. He had promised he would visit soon, but soon had never come. Now the coffin before him, covered in white lilies, her favorite, was a reminder that time had run out. The service moved forward in a blur. An organ played low notes that reverberated through the stone chapel walls. A close friend of Margaret delivered the eulogy, recalling her discipline, her loyalty to the family, and her relentless pursuit of excellence. People nodded, dabbed at their eyes, and whispered words of admiration. Daniel listened, but his mind wandered. He was caught between sorrow for the woman who had raised him and unease over the years of distance that had grown between them. It was during this fog of emotion that he saw her, Lauren Hayes. She stood apart from the main group of mourners, partially hidden beneath a black umbrella. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. The sight of her jolted Daniel's memory back nearly a decade, to the last time he had seen her face. Their marriage had ended abruptly, with paperwork signed and doors closed. His mother had never spoken kindly of Lauren, often criticizing her background and questioning her suitability as part of the Whitmore dynasty. Arguments had erupted, harsh words had been exchanged, and in the end Daniel had walked away, convinced that the marriage could not survive under so much pressure. But now, here she was, at his mother's funeral. And she was not alone. 2 children clung to her side. Their small hands gripped her skirt, their eyes darting nervously between the strangers surrounding them. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he studied their faces. 1 boy, 1 girl. They were young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with features that mirrored his own. The boy's jawline resembled his father's side, while the girl's wide-set eyes reminded him of family portraits lining the Whitmore Library. It was not imagination, nor coincidence. It was blood staring back at him. Daniel's chest tightened. He blinked, as if hoping the vision would dissolve with the rain. But the children remained, shifting uncomfortably as if sensing his gaze. His mind spun with questions. Why had no one told him? Why had Lauren kept them hidden? What kind of deception had unfolded behind his back? The funeral ended, mourners dispersing under umbrellas, murmuring polite condolences. Daniel felt none of it. His world had tilted on its axis, and he could think of nothing but the woman and the children who stood at a distance. His feet carried him forward almost involuntarily, across the wet grass and toward them. Lauren stiffened as he approached. For a moment, it seemed as though she might turn and leave, vanishing again into the shadows of his life. But she stayed, gripping the children's hands more tightly. Daniel stopped in front of her, his voice hoarse but controlled. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His eyes flicked to the children. "And who are they?" Lauren hesitated. The children pressed closer to her, one hiding behind her leg. She met Daniel's stare with eyes that glistened in the dim light. For several seconds, silence hung between them, broken only by the patter of rain. Then, with a breath that seemed to drain the strength from her, she spoke. "Daniel, meet Ethan and Grace. They're your children." The words struck like a thunderclap. Daniel's knees nearly buckled, and the world around him seemed to fade into static. He had children. Twins. And no one had told him. Rage, disbelief, sorrow, all collided inside him. "How long?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "They're 8, she replied softly. 8 years. 8 years of birthdays, school days, laughter and tears, moments he had been robbed of. The enormity of it crushed him. He looked again at Ethan and Grace. The boy's gaze was curious, cautious. The girl clutched her mother's skirt tightly, her lips pressed into a nervous line. Daniel felt the air drain from his lungs. He had come to bury his mother, but instead, he was forced to face a truth she had hidden from him. Beneath the rain, amid the silence of graves, he realized the story of Margaret Whitmore's control was not over. It was only beginning. The Whitmore name had been etched into American society for more than a century, and with it came a reputation for wealth, prestige, and an unyielding grip on tradition. To outsiders, the family estate in Vermont was a picture of refinement, where stone walls carried the weight of history and manicured gardens testified to generations of discipline. To those who knew the family personally, however, the Whitmores were less a dynasty and more a fortress, impenetrable, tightly controlled, and ruled by the formidable presence of Margaret Whitmore. Margaret was a woman whose influence stretched far beyond her household. Born into a wealthy banking family in New England, she had married into the Whitmores in her early 20s and quickly established herself as the matriarch. Her standards were high, her judgment swift, and her definition of family loyalty absolute. Friends described her as gracious in public, always polished, always eloquent. Behind closed doors, she was known for a sharp tongue and an instinct for control that few dared to challenge. Daniel grew up as her only son, the sole heir to a fortune that included real estate holdings, stock portfolios, and eventually, a seat at the head of Whitmore Industries, a company that had evolved from shipping into technology investments and global innovation. From childhood, he had felt the dual weight of privilege and expectation. His earliest memories were of bedtime stories told in a stately nursery, not of fairy tales, but of Whitmore ancestors who built empires, negotiated deals, and carried the family crest with pride. His mother's voice was firm even in those moments of intimacy. "You are a Whitmore. You must never forget what that means." By the time Daniel reached adolescence, the lessons had hardened into commandments. Excellence was not optional. Weakness was intolerable. His education was meticulously curated, from private academies to Ivy League universities. Summers were spent shadowing board meetings rather than playing in the streets. While other teenagers learned to drive or go to prom, Daniel learned how to analyze market reports and deliver speeches at charity dinners. The more his mother pushed, the more he absorbed the belief that his life was not his own. It belonged to the family, to the legacy, to the unbroken line of Whitmores who had come before. Yet even in the rigid structure of his upbringing, Daniel carried within him a quiet rebellion. He sought independence in small ways, sneaking out for late-night walks, forming friendships with people his mother disapproved of, and eventually, falling in love with someone far removed from the world of Whitmore expectations. That someone was Lauren Hayes. Lauren was the daughter of a Boston schoolteacher, raised in modest circumstances that valued sincerity over status. She and Daniel met during his graduate years at Stanford, a chance encounter at a campus library where their shared love of literature drew them into conversation. For the first time, Daniel experienced companionship that was not transactional, not calculated, not bound by appearances. Lauren listened to him not as a Whitmore, not as a future CEO, but as a man with dreams and doubts. Their relationship grew quickly, perhaps recklessly. Daniel found in Lauren the warmth and authenticity that had been absent from his world of boardrooms and banquets. Against his mother's wishes, he proposed. Margaret's disapproval was immediate and fierce. She considered Lauren an outsider, unworthy of the Whitmore name, a threat to the purity of their lineage. But Daniel, emboldened by love, defied her for the first time. He married Lauren in a small ceremony on the West Coast, far from the judging eyes of New England society. For a brief period, happiness seemed possible. Daniel spoke of building a new chapter, one where family meant more than financial reports, where love mattered more than legacy. But Margaret's influence was insidious. She visited rarely, but when she did, her words cut deep. She planted doubts in Daniel's mind about Lauren's intentions, about her ability to withstand the pressures of a dynasty. Arguments began to seep into the marriage, small at first, then sharper, fueled by Margaret's whispering presence. Within a few years, the marriage crumbled. Papers were signed. Silence followed. To Daniel, it seemed like the natural, if painful, conclusion of two incompatible worlds colliding. He buried himself in his work, expanding Whitmore Industries into technology, amassing wealth and recognition, convincing himself that sacrifice was necessary. He told himself he had chosen ambition over affection because ambition could not betray him. What Daniel never knew, what Margaret had ensured he would never know, was that Lauren had been pregnant when the divorce finalized. Margaret intercepted letters, phone calls, any attempt Lauren made to reach out. She weaponized her legal power, warning Lauren that any attempt to involve Daniel would result in custody battles she could never win. Isolated, overwhelmed, and fearful, Lauren disappeared with the twins into a quiet life outside Boston. And so, Daniel became the very man his mother had raised him to be, successful, formidable, admired, but alone. The world saw him as a visionary entrepreneur, a billionaire who moved effortlessly between Silicon Valley boardrooms and Wall Street meetings. What the world did not see was the emptiness that lingered when he returned to his penthouse apartments and country estates, the quiet ache of a life defined by achievement but starved of intimacy. The funeral of Margaret Whitmore brought these hidden truths crashing into the open. For Daniel, seeing Lauren again was not just the reappearance of a lost love, it was the revelation of an entire life stolen from him. The boy and girl at her side were not strangers, they were the missing chapters of his story, the legacy he had unknowingly abandoned. As he stared at them, the foundation of his carefully constructed identity began to crack. He had been told all his life that his purpose was to uphold the Whitmore name. But what if the Whitmore name itself had been built on deception, manipulation, and control? What if the true inheritance left to him was not wealth or power, but the burden of uncovering the lies that had defined his family for decades? In that moment, Daniel's grief for his mother was overshadowed by a deeper grief for the years lost, the childhood he had missed, the trust that had been betrayed. The funeral was no longer about Margaret's death. It was about the unraveling of her legacy and the beginning of a reckoning that Daniel could no longer avoid. The day of Margaret Whitmore's funeral was meant to close one chapter of history, but for Daniel, it became the moment when a hidden story forced itself into the open. Until that day, he believed the past was sealed. His marriage to Lauren Hayes had ended, the doors firmly shut, the silence unbroken. What remained was his mother's memory, his empire, and the burden of being the last Whitmore heir. Yet as the rain fell steadily over the Vermont hillside, fate delivered him a revelation that turned grief into confusion and confusion into outrage. When the final notes of the organ faded and the casket was lowered into the ground, Daniel felt the sharp sting of finality. Guests murmured condolences, hands squeezed his shoulder, and umbrellas drifted away across the muddy path. He stood still, unable to leave, as if rooted to the spot by guilt. It was then, through the shifting crowd, that he noticed her. Lauren Hayes had not changed as much as he expected. Her chestnut hair, once kept in a loose braid during their university days, now framed her face in a more mature, refined style. She wore a simple black coat, elegant but understated, as though determined not to draw attention. Yet her presence radiated something powerful, an unspoken connection to a time Daniel had tried to bury. But it wasn't just Lauren that captured his attention. At her side, holding tightly to the fabric of her coat, stood two children. Their small frames were nearly hidden beneath the large umbrella she carried. Daniel's eyes fixed on them instinctively, and in that instant, his breath caught. The resemblance was undeniable. The boy had a sharp jawline that mirrored Daniel's own childhood photographs. The girl's wide-set hazel eyes carried an expression he had seen countless times in Whitmore portraits that lined the family estate. For a moment, the world blurred. The sound of rain, the shuffle of footsteps, the drone of hushed voices, all of it faded. Daniel felt as though a mirror had been lifted before him, reflecting not the man he was, but the man he should have been. 2 children. 2 lives. And he had known nothing of them. A flood of emotion surged. Disbelief, anger, sorrow, regret, they collided so forcefully that his chest tightened. He wondered if grief was making him hallucinate, if the shock of losing his mother had distorted reality. But when the boy glanced up, his gaze cautious yet piercing, Daniel saw himself in miniature. No grief could invent such a likeness. This was truth staring him in the face. He moved toward them almost without thought, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. Lauren stiffened as soon as she noticed his approach. For an instant, it seemed she might turn and leave, taking the children with her. But she stood her ground, her body tense, her hand gripping theirs protectively. Daniel stopped just a few feet away, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Lauren," he said, his tone rough, nearly a whisper. "Why are you here?" His eyes shifted to the children. "Who are they?" Lauren met his stare, her expression torn between defiance and fear. The boy pressed closer to her side, while the girl half hid behind her mother's coat. The silence between them felt unbearable, stretching longer than Daniel thought possible. Then, with a deep breath, Lauren answered. "These are your children," she said quietly. "Ethan and Grace." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He staggered, his hands trembling at his sides. His pulse raced so violently he thought he might collapse. His children? 8 years old, by the look of them. 8 years of birthdays, of first steps, of first words, of scraped knees and school plays, all stolen from him. Daniel's mind reeled back to the day of their divorce. The shouting matches, the final signatures on paper, the coldness that followed. Never once had she told him she was pregnant. Never once had a whisper reached him that their story was not truly over. The fury that surged through him was matched only by a crushing sorrow. "How could you keep them from me?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with rage. Lauren flinched at the accusation, her eyes glistening with tears she fought to contain. "I tried," she whispered. "You don't understand. Your mother made sure you would never know." The mention of Margaret's name deepened the wound. Daniel's grief twisted into suspicion. Of course his mother had despised Lauren. Of course she had believed Lauren unworthy of the Whitmore name. But could she have gone so far as to hide his own children from him? The thought was unbearable, and yet, in that moment, it felt horrifyingly plausible. The children clung closer, sensing the tension but not understanding its depth. Ethan peered at Daniel with wide, questioning eyes, as though trying to measure whether this imposing stranger was friend or foe. Grace's grip on her mother's coat tightened, her face half hidden, her small voice whispering something Daniel could not hear. Daniel's chest heaved. He wanted to scream, to demand explanations, to deny the truth that stood before him. But he could not look away from the twins. Every detail of their presence carved into him the reality of what had been stolen, their first words, their laughter, their cries in the night. He had been absent from all of it, not by choice but by manipulation. The storm inside him raged even as the rain continued to fall. He had buried his mother, but in the process, unearthed a secret more devastating than her death. The woman who had raised him, who had shaped him into the man he was, had also denied him the most fundamental bond of all, that of a father to his children. As mourners drifted away, Daniel and Lauren remained locked in silence. Around them, the funeral grounds emptied until only the whisper of rain remained. Finally, Lauren spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. "I never wanted it this way," she said. "I tried to reach you. Letters, calls, everything I could think of. But she blocked me at every turn. She told me you wanted nothing to do with me, or with the baby I was carrying. I was young, alone, terrified. I thought I was protecting them." Daniel felt fury rise, but beneath it, a deeper ache. Could it be true? Could his mother's reach have extended so far that even his marriage, his children, his very future had been manipulated? His eyes returned to the twins. Ethan shifted uneasily, while Grace peeked from behind her mother's coat, curiosity fighting fear. They were strangers to him, yet not strangers at all. They were his blood, his legacy, his truth. And for the first time in his life, Daniel realized that the greatest battle he would ever face was not in boardrooms or markets, but in the fragile space between the lies he had been told and the family he had been denied. The funeral that was supposed to end one life had, instead, revealed two new ones. And Daniel Whitmore stood at the threshold of a reckoning that would change everything he thought he knew about his mother, about Lauren, and about himself. For Daniel Whitmore, the funeral had become a stage where grief and shock collided, leaving him gasping for answers. The rain still fell, though lighter now, as mourners dispersed into their waiting cars. But Daniel remained, rooted in confrontation. The revelation that Ethan and Grace were his children had cracked his world wide open. Every instinct in him demanded clarity, demanded to know why 8 years had been stolen from him. Lauren Hayes stood firm, her hands holding tightly to the twins as though bracing against a storm not of weather but of truth. Daniel's voice trembled as he pressed her further. 8 years, Lauren. 8 years, and you said nothing. Do you have any idea what you've done? The question was sharp, almost accusatory, but beneath it was a plea, a desperate need to understand. Lauren's eyes glistened, but her voice carried a quiet strength. I tried, Daniel. You don't know how many times I tried. But your mother made sure you would never hear from me. Margaret Whitmore's name hung between them like a shadow. For Daniel, it explained too much and not nearly enough. He knew his mother had disliked Lauren, had fought against their marriage, had insisted she was unworthy of the Whitmore name. But to imagine that she had gone as far as intercepting letters, silencing calls, threatening custody battles, it was nearly unthinkable. And yet, standing before him, Lauren's trembling voice made the unthinkable real. She told me you wanted nothing to do with me, Lauren continued. She told me you had moved on, that you didn't want a child with me. She said if I tried to fight, she had lawyers who would destroy me in court. I was young, Daniel. I was terrified. And I believed her. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. Rage welled up inside him, not only at his mother but at the cruel manipulation that had robbed him of fatherhood. You should have fought harder, he spat, though even as he said it, he felt the weight of the unfairness. Lauren had been alone, and Margaret had always been ruthless when it came to protecting the family image. The children shifted uncomfortably, sensing the rising tension. Ethan's eyes narrowed, studying Daniel with cautious curiosity, while Grace tucked herself deeper behind her mother's coat. The sight tore at Daniel. He had wanted to explode, to demand more answers, but the fragile presence of the children kept his anger in check. His voice dropped lower, thick with hurt. Do they know? Lauren shook her head. They know they have a father. But they don't know it's you. I didn't want them growing up with bitterness or confusion. I wanted to protect them. The weight of those words pressed down on Daniel. Protect them, from him, from the truth, from the family legacy. What did that say about the Whitmore name? For the first time, he saw it not as a shield of honor but as a weapon wielded by his mother to bend lives to her will. Silence stretched again. The drizzle eased, leaving only the drip of water from tree branches above. Finally, Daniel looked directly at the twins. Ethan. Grace, he said quietly, testing the names on his tongue. The children peeked at him, unsure. I'm your father. The words felt foreign and yet deeply natural. He expected resistance, shock, perhaps denial. But the children only stared at him with wide eyes, curiosity outweighing fear. Grace's lips parted slightly, as if forming a question she couldn't quite speak. Ethan shifted his weight but said nothing. Their silence was deafening. Lauren's eyes softened, though her posture remained guarded. They don't understand everything yet. They're still children, Daniel. This isn't a revelation to be forced on them all at once. But for Daniel, patience was unbearable. 8 years had already been lost, stolen by deception. How could he waste another moment? His voice cracked with desperation. You had no right to keep them from me. Lauren's gaze hardened. And you had no idea what your mother was capable of. I wasn't strong enough to fight her. But don't mistake that for not caring. Every day, I thought about what I'd taken from them, what I'd taken from you. But at the time, survival felt like the only choice. Daniel turned away briefly, staring at the gravestones that stretched in neat rows across the hillside. His mother's casket lay beneath fresh soil, but her power still lingered. Even in death, she had left scars that would not heal easily. He realized that confronting Lauren would not erase the years lost. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences remained: 2 children who barely knew him, and a woman who carried the weight of choices forced upon her. The tension between them was unbearable, yet neither moved to leave. Perhaps both understood that this moment was too pivotal, too fragile to end abruptly. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence again. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his tone stripped of anger, left only with raw vulnerability. But I need to try. Lauren's expression shifted, softening for the first time since their encounter began. Then start with them, she said, glancing at the children. Not with me. Not with the past. Start with Ethan and Grace. Daniel nodded slowly, though uncertainty gnawed at him. He wanted to reach out, to kneel before them, to show them he was not a stranger but their father. But he hesitated, afraid of frightening them further. Instead, he simply held their gaze. The quiet bond of recognition flickered there, fragile but undeniable. The drizzle stopped entirely, leaving the air thick with silence. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled from the chapel. It marked the end of the service, but for Daniel, it felt like the tolling of an alarm. His life had shifted. His future was no longer defined solely by Whitmore Industries or his mother's legacy. It was now entangled with 2 children whose existence rewrote everything he thought he knew. As the small family turned to leave, Daniel felt torn between chasing after them and giving them space. His heart screamed to close the gap, to claim what was his, but his mind reminded him of the delicate path ahead. He was a stranger to Ethan and Grace, no matter how strong the blood connection. Trust would not come overnight. He remained by the grave as their figures receded down the path. His hands trembled, his breath shallow. The empire he controlled, the fortune he commanded, all of it suddenly felt hollow compared to the simple truth that had been denied him, the chance to be a father. The funeral was over, but the storm was only beginning. Daniel now carried a new mission, one not measured in profits or power, but in fragile bonds and lost years. Margaret Whitmore had ruled his past. But Ethan and Grace would determine his future. 2 days after the funeral, the Whitmore estate was not filled with silence, but with tension. The grief of Margaret's burial had hardly settled when another gathering was called. This time, there were no mourners, no flowers, no organ music. Instead, the air in the estate's library was heavy with legal formality. The room itself had always carried an air of intimidation. Dark mahogany shelves stretched to the ceiling, lined with volumes of law, finance, and history. An antique chandelier spilled golden light onto a long polished table where the family's lawyer, Richard Coleman, had laid out a stack of documents. To Daniel, the scene felt like the true burial, not of his mother, but of whatever peace he might have hoped to recover. Richard adjusted his glasses, his tone even but serious. We are here to read the last will and testament of Margaret Whitmore. Daniel stood near one of the tall windows, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the manicured gardens outside. He could hardly look at the papers. Nearby, Lauren sat rigidly in a wooden chair, the twins restless at her side, fidgeting with curiosity. Their presence made the atmosphere more volatile. Daniel still reeled from the revelation that they were his children. Now, the very documents his mother left behind threatened to dictate their future. Richard began with the expected clauses: donations to hospitals, endowments for museums, provisions for loyal staff. Daniel barely listened. It was exactly what he expected from Margaret: generosity for appearances, order in every detail. But then Richard paused, clearing his throat as though bracing for impact. There is an additional provision, he said, his eyes flicking toward Daniel. One that concerns the matter of heirs. Daniel turned sharply. Go on. Richard unfolded another page. If Ethan and Grace Hayes are proven to be the biological children of Daniel Whitmore, they are to inherit a substantial portion of Margaret's personal assets, placed in trust until they reach the age of 21. Lauren gasped softly. The twins, too young to grasp the meaning, glanced between the adults with wide eyes. Daniel felt a strange rush of conflicting emotions, a flicker of relief that his children were acknowledged, followed immediately by resentment. His mother had hidden them for years, yet now, in her death, she had bound them into her estate as though they were pawns in a game of legacy. But Richard was not finished. He adjusted his tie and continued. Furthermore, Daniel Whitmore will retain controlling interest in Whitmore Industries only if he establishes a stable family life within 1 year. This includes marriage, or otherwise proving to the Board of Trustees that he can provide a household consistent with Margaret's standards. The words struck like ice. Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. "She's still dictating my life from the grave," he muttered. Lauren's expression shifted, shock mingled with an old, familiar pain. Daniel could sense her unease, but he was too consumed by fury to offer comfort. His mother's influence was suffocating him even now, setting conditions that turned love into obligation, fatherhood into a contract. Richard, trying to soften the blow, added, "If the conditions are not met, the controlling shares will revert to the Whitmore Trust, to be redistributed under the board's supervision." Daniel's mind reeled. He had spent a decade building the company, steering it into new industries, expanding its influence across the globe. And now, everything, the empire, the family name, the legacy, was threatened by a clause written in cold legal ink. To keep what was his, he would have to play by his mother's rules. The children, oblivious to the magnitude of what was unfolding, whispered to each other, their voices carrying across the silent room. Grace tugged at Ethan's sleeve, pointing toward the chandelier. Ethan tried to stifle a giggle. The innocence of their distraction cut painfully against the severity of the moment. Daniel stared at them, his chest heavy. They were the reason his mother had orchestrated this cruel test. They were the proof of love she had denied him, and now they were the condition of his survival as head of Whitmore Industries. His rage threatened to boil over, but beneath it lay something else, an ache he could not deny. For years, he had lived for control, for power, for reputation. But none of it mattered now. What mattered were 2 children who carried his name, his blood, his future. The meeting ended with Richard's solemn reminder, "You have 1 year, Daniel. The clock starts today." After the lawyer left, silence thickened in the room. Daniel remained standing, pacing near the fireplace, while Lauren sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The twins had grown restless and wandered toward the shelves, tracing their fingers across old leather spines without understanding their weight. "She gave me a year," Daniel said at last, his voice low but bitter. "But the board, the press, everyone, they won't wait that long. They'll want answers sooner." He turned abruptly toward Lauren. "Do you see what she's done? Even in death, she's trying to control me." Lauren's eyes flickered with emotions Daniel couldn't quite decipher. Hope, fear, perhaps even guilt. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked quietly. The question disarmed him. He had prepared to fight, to rage, to curse his mother's name. But what he wanted, what he truly wanted, remained a fragile, uncertain truth. He looked at the children, at Ethan's curious gaze and Grace's shy smile. The empire, the fortune, the conditions, all of it seemed small compared to the possibility of reclaiming what he had lost. "I want to be a father," he said finally. The words trembled, but they were honest. "Not just a CEO. Not just the Whitmore heir. I want to know them. I want to give them what was stolen from us." Lauren's expression softened, though hesitation lingered. "Then start there," she whispered. "The rest will follow." For Daniel, it was both a turning point and a warning. His life had split into 2 paths, one dictated by contracts, clauses, and conditions, the other by fragile human bonds that demanded patience, humility, and love. To succeed, he would have to navigate both. And in that moment, he understood the truth that would guide the battles to come: Margaret Whitmore may have written the rules, but only he could decide whether to obey them or break free. The words of the will clung to Daniel like a curse. A year. That was all Margaret had given him to prove his life fit her vision of stability. It was not grief that followed him in the nights after the funeral, but an unrelenting sense of entrapment. His mother's hand reached out from beyond the grave, still shaping his choices, still forcing him into corners where every step forward felt like a test. But Daniel was not a boy anymore, nor a son bending beneath the weight of his mother's expectations. He was a man who had built an empire, and now, he was a father discovering the children he had been denied. And so, for the first time in years, Daniel set aside business reports and market forecasts. He began his own investigation, not into markets or competitors, but into the secrets buried inside his own family estate. The Whitmore mansion was sprawling, a labyrinth of halls, attics, and wings that had accumulated history like dust. Generations had left their traces, portraits, heirlooms, trunks filled with forgotten relics. Daniel had always avoided the attic, dismissing it as a relic of the past. But now, suspicion gnawed at him. Margaret had been meticulous, leaving no detail unguarded in life. If she had manipulated his marriage and hidden his children, there had to be proof. Somewhere in that house, the truth waited. One evening, long after the twins had gone to bed in guest rooms under the supervision of a caretaker, Daniel climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of mothballs. Cobwebs hung like drapes from the beams, and trunks sat piled upon each other, their locks rusted but intact. With a flashlight in hand, Daniel began opening them one by one. At first, the trunks contained predictable things: old clothes, faded family photographs, antique toys. But deeper into the attic, he uncovered a smaller chest, tucked away behind a broken dresser. Its lid creaked as he forced it open, revealing a velvet-covered journal and a bundle of sealed envelopes. The sight made his heart pound. Margaret had been many things, but careless was not one of them. If she had hidden these items, there was a reason. Daniel set the chest on an old table and opened the journal. The handwriting was unmistakably his mother's, precise, elegant, each letter crafted with control. He flipped through the pages, scanning notes about social gatherings, charitable events, even menus for elaborate dinners. At first, it seemed harmless, the musings of a woman obsessed with appearances. But then he stopped cold at a passage dated 6 months before his wedding to Lauren. Daniel insists on marrying that girl. I see the way he looks at her, and I cannot allow it. She does not belong in this family. If he chooses her, he chooses weakness. I will not permit the Whitmore legacy to be diluted. Daniel's chest tightened. His hands trembled as he turned the page. More entries followed, each one more chilling than the last. I spoke to Richard today. He assures me that if matters escalate, we can argue unfit motherhood. Money and influence can build the case. The girl will not stand a chance. I intercepted another letter. She still tries to reach him. Foolish. He must believe she has abandoned him. Only then will he refocus on his destiny. The words stabbed him. He could almost hear her voice, calm and certain, as if she were speaking in the room. It was proof, not speculation, not memory warped by grief, but written evidence of her manipulation. She had orchestrated his divorce, cut off his contact, and stolen his children from him, all in the name of preserving the Whitmore legacy. Daniel closed the journal and turned to the bundle of envelopes. They were addressed to him, but never opened. One by one, he slit them open. Letters poured out, written in Lauren's familiar hand. Pleas for him to call, to meet, to listen. Words filled with desperation, hope, and later, heartbreak. Some even mentioned her pregnancy, begging him not to ignore her. The letters told a story he had never known, a woman abandoned not by choice, but by force, locked out by a mother who held the power to silence her. Daniel sank into a chair, the letters scattered across his lap. His entire life, he had been trained to see Margaret as the pillar of the family, the woman who had sacrificed everything for his future. But the reality was far darker. She had not sacrificed for him, she had sacrificed him, molding him into a weapon of legacy and stripping away his chance at happiness. As the weight of truth settled, Daniel noticed another envelope at the bottom of the chest. Unlike the others, this one bore his name in bold, deliberate strokes. It had been sealed with wax, unbroken until now. With trembling fingers, he cracked it open. Inside was a letter written in Margaret's hand. Unlike the journal, the tone here was almost intimate. Daniel, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. You will despise me for what I've done, but you must understand, I acted not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The world preys on weakness. I wanted to protect you, even from yourself. I chose to interfere, because I could not trust you to choose wisely. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you will prove me wrong. That is why I left you the year. Not as punishment, but as a test. If you can build a family of strength, if you can fight for it, then you will have surpassed me. Only then will you be free. Daniel's vision blurred with tears. For years he had sought his mother's approval. Now, all he felt was betrayal mixed with sorrow. Was this her idea of love? A twisted game where protection meant destruction, where control masqueraded as care. He placed the letter back into the envelope, his mind spiraling. Margaret had shaped his entire life, but in doing so, she had left scars deeper than wealth or power could hide. He had been robbed of years with his children, of trust with Lauren, of freedom to live on his own terms. Yet, hidden within her final words, there was an opening, a chance to redefine himself, not as the heir she demanded, but as the father his children needed. Downstairs, the house was quiet, the children asleep. Daniel remained in the attic, surrounded by letters and memories that cut like glass. He realized this investigation was more than uncovering the past. It was about deciding whether the Whitmore legacy would continue to be a prison, or whether he would finally break its chains. For the first time, Daniel understood the true battle. It wasn't against the Board of Trustees, nor against the legal conditions of the will. The real battle was with the ghost of his mother and the manipulations she left behind. Only by facing them could he reclaim his family, his identity, and perhaps even a measure of peace. The attic had given Daniel everything he feared and everything he needed. Proof of betrayal, words in his mother's own hand, letters that should have been his years ago, all of it lay scattered before him like shards of glass. The past was no longer a question of memory or suspicion, it was documented, undeniable. Margaret Whitmore had not simply disapproved of his choices. She had engineered his downfall as a husband, stripped him of fatherhood, and reshaped his destiny with ruthless precision. But discovery alone did not heal. It only deepened the ache of years lost. When Daniel descended from the attic that night, the house was silent except for the faint creak of old beams. The twins were asleep in their rooms, and Lauren had retreated to her quarters. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like a stranger in his own estate. The grand halls and portraits of ancestors that once symbolized pride now seemed like prison walls, reminders of a family legacy soaked in control. In the following days, Daniel wrestled with the weight of choice. His mother's will demanded stability, a year to prove he could be the patriarch she envisioned. The board of Whitmore Industries would not wait forever. Rumors had already begun to circle in Manhattan boardrooms about his personal life. Investors whispered about weakness. Newspapers speculated on scandal. In the world Daniel inhabited, perception was power, and his mother had known that better than anyone. But Daniel no longer cared only about the company. The faces of Ethan and Grace haunted him, not in anger but in longing. He saw them in fleeting moments, Grace laughing as she ran down the garden path, Ethan asking endless questions about the family portraits. Each moment sharpened the wound of absence, yet also lit a path forward. For the first time in years, Daniel saw a life that was more than balance sheets and quarterly earnings. He saw a chance to become what had been denied him, a father. Still, the path was fraught with obstacles. Trust was fragile. Ethan remained cautious, studying him with suspicion, as though trying to decide if this man could be trusted. Grace was shy, often clinging to Lauren's side. And Lauren herself was guarded. She allowed conversations but rarely opened the door to reconciliation. The years apart had built walls that no revelation could instantly tear down. Daniel tried anyway. He began with the small things. Breakfasts in the sunlit kitchen, where he let the twins choose their favorite dishes. Evenings spent reading stories aloud, fumbling through character voices that made them giggle. Walks in the garden, where he answered Ethan's endless curiosity about the estate's history or listened to Grace whisper about her favorite flowers. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the barrier of distance. The children's laughter filled the halls in ways that felt unfamiliar but right. One afternoon, Daniel took them to the estate's pond with fishing rods. The day was bright, a rare moment of peace. Ethan squealed when he caught his first small fish, and Grace clapped her hands in delight. Daniel knelt beside them, guiding their hands gently, showing them how to release the fish back into the water. In that simple act, he felt a joy he hadn't known in decades. It wasn't empire, it wasn't legacy, it was life. Yet the shadow of the will loomed. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Daniel and Lauren found themselves in the drawing room. The air was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "She gave me a year," he said, his voice low. "A year to prove I can build what she thought was missing. The board is already pressing. They expect me to marry, to settle everything neatly." Lauren's eyes flickered with mixed emotions. "And what do you want?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel stared at the fire, his thoughts unraveling. He wanted the company, yes. But more than that, he wanted his children, their trust, their love. He wanted redemption, not for the empire, but for himself. "I want to be their father," he said finally. "Not because of a clause. Not because of her conditions. But because I should have been there, and I wasn't." Lauren studied him carefully. Her voice was softer when she answered. "Then show them that. Show them, not me. Words aren't enough anymore." It was not forgiveness, but it was a path. As summer turned to autumn, Daniel devoted himself to the fragile rebuilding of a family. He continued to lead Whitmore Industries, attending meetings and navigating markets, but his priorities shifted. For the first time, shareholders were not his only concern. At night, when investors demanded clarity, he thought instead of Ethan's curiosity and Grace's shy smile. For every headline questioning his future, he answered with quiet moments of fatherhood, unpublicized but powerful. In the end, the lesson Margaret had left was not the one she intended. She had believed control would preserve the family. But it was love, messy and uncertain, that began to knit it back together. The children did not care about shares or legacies. They cared about stories before bed, about laughter at the dinner table, about whether their father would be there tomorrow. One crisp evening, Daniel found himself back in the attic, the journal and letters neatly stacked in the chest. He closed the lid and locked it. The past was documented, the evidence undeniable. But he realized now that living in those pages would consume him. He had unearthed the truth, and it had freed him. What mattered was not the manipulation but the choice he made after it. Standing by the window, he looked down at the gardens where Ethan and Grace were chasing each other under Lauren's watchful eye. Their laughter rose like music, weaving into the fading daylight. Daniel felt the ache of all the years lost, but also the fragile hope of what could still be built. His mother's voice would always linger in memory, but it no longer defined him. For Daniel Whitmore, the reckoning had come. The empire might remain under scrutiny, the board might continue to press, and the world might judge. But his path was clear. He would fight, not for contracts or for legacy, but for the children who bore his name and the woman who had once stood by him against all odds. In the end, the Whitmore story was not about wealth or scandal. It was about the crime of control, the theft of trust, and the resilience required to reclaim it. Secrets can be hidden for years, but truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it demands not just recognition, but transformation. For Daniel, that transformation had begun. The test his mother left him was not about marriage, nor stability, nor reputation. It was about love, the one force she could never master, the one choice that was his alone to make. And for the first time, Daniel chose freely.